Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about a very serious problem, a problem that faces all Americans, and one that is not new here in Washington. If I can start, I'd like to read a quote that some of my colleagues have also used during this morning's debate. And if I may, let me just quote it once again. Leadership means that the buck stops here. Instead, Washington is shifting the burden of bad choices today onto the backs of our children and grandchildren. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. Americans deserve better. That was done by Senator Barack Obama back in 2006, and I frankly agree. And just to put it in perspective, back in 2006, we were running a deficit. We had an administration that was running a deficit of about $400 billion. Just highlighting the point that this spending problem that we have here in Washington is on both sides of the aisle. This doesn't rest with one political party or another. It just outlines the problem that Washington has a spending problem. The debt that we have today, we're up against our debt ceiling. It's about $14 trillion. The real debt, however, is much greater than that. It's closer to $100 trillion. The deficit that we deal with, it was about $400 billion back in 2006. Today, it's about $1.5 trillion. Now, what does that mean? My daughter, who's 9, she knows what 1.5 is. She says it's a little bit more than 1 and not quite 2. But 1.5 trillion works out to be about $3.4 million a minute. To put that in better perspective, it's $58,000 a second. We can't even say it fast enough. This is a problem. How do we get out of this problem? We have to map out a course. It's a budget. The Republicans passed a budget. The House passed a budget outlining a way for us to be able to cut back over $6 trillion over the next decade. I would argue that American families and households all across the land operate on a budget. Businesses do the same. Yet we happen to not be able to do that here in Washington. The United States Senate has not picked up or passed a budget in over 750 days. The American family wouldn't operate like that. I know as a small business owner, I couldn't keep my doors open if I didn't have a budget to outline where our priorities were going to be. It is a blueprint. It's not a final standing bill or thing that's going to say exactly how we're going to spend it, but it is a blueprint going forward so that we can get those in the Senate and elsewhere to be able to come together so that we can map out how are we going to get out of this mess. Because I do agree with the President when he says that the choices that we're making today, the bad choices of today, are going to be placed on the backs of our children and grandchildren. For me, that's unacceptable. I decided to run for Congress largely because the amount of money that we were spending in Washington was going to be unconscionable for me to pass along to my children. I have a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 4-year-old. By the time they're my age, we're going to have to pay exactly double in taxes just to service the government. We pay 42 cents of every single dollar we have just to service our debt. The administration now is asking us to raise the debt ceiling. This is an important issue. But I'm here to tell you that we need to have some leadership. Leadership is critical at this point in time. What is the plan? I don't want to talk about bickering. I want to make sure that colleagues on both sides of the aisle come to the table. We know that there are negotiations going on right now, but I still would like to have a plan articulated to the American public. What is the plan? Because simply raising the debt ceiling without a plan on how we're going to pay down this debt is like, well, it's like sitting around the kitchen table and not worrying about the credit card debt of an irresponsible teenager. You wouldn't do that at home. We wouldn't do that in business. You should expect that your government does the same. Now, when we look at this debt crisis that we have, as a small business owner, I look at it somewhat like a business. I look at it that we've just purchased a business, and we think it's the greatest business in the world with the United States of America. That business has some debt, and we're obligated to pay that debt. We just have to figure out how it is that we are going to restructure that business so that we can pay down that debt and make it a strong, viable business going forward. That's what we have to do. To simply raise the debt ceiling and not have to restructure would be a violation of everything that we hold dear. So with that, I call on leadership. Leadership here in Washington from those on both sides of the aisle to come together to solve the problems of our time and put our country first.
Time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.